You know, they played that song too much. I hate that song. I do.
Why didn't you tell me
No,
that?
I don't care if you play it coming in, but I just hate it. Sometimes there's two songs that I hate. I hate songs that they just played absolutely to death. Growing up, that was one.
That was.
And I hate songs that they now play on commercials. That makes like the Kentucky Fried Chicken song with Sweet Home Alabama.
Oh, good Lord.
I used to love that song. Now when it was connected to KFC, I hate that song now.
What about
my kids love KFC.
what about like Who Are You on the TV shows and all that stuff by the Who? You know, I mean, does that do it for you?
Yeah, I hate it when it gets put on a commercial or it's connected to a TV show or something. I hate it after that.
We are that demographic. Every commercial is playing stuff.
Jim, get up to the mic there, brother.
There we go.
There you go.
We're playing every commercial we listened to in the 80s is now that commercial lead-in music, and we're listening to that. And you know, when you start hearing Britney Spears on, a adult diapers commercial, you know you're too old.
Yeah, exactly.
Hit me one more time.
Exactly.
And the comedian in the studio, that's Jim Gwinner, partner with LS2 Group.
Great to be here.
I always like to tease Jim. I said he is the nicest man in politics, and I'm like, you need to find another line of work. You're too nice to be in this business.
There's no reason not to be nice, man. I've got friends on both sides of the aisle. I've got friends on every ideology. It is too short of a life to be too grumpy.
Yeah, but I can't imagine someone like not liking you. You know, people in politics,
it makes them
unfortunately,
effective.
people don't like you for some reason, and it happens. But everybody loves Jim Gwinner.
I'm sure the opponents in the Capitol, when they don't get their bills passed, don't like me very much, but I'm okay with that.
Exactly. And also, we've got Representative Weeman. He's going to stay in the studio with us, and we're going to banter around a little bit. You know, in the last section, we talked a little bit about pension reform, and Jim is kind of a semi-expert on that as well. And a lot of people, we need to get this out there, a lot of people don't know how much the government is on the hook for these pension plans and just how much, they're in trouble for these.
Yeah, it does. And it also kind of leads into some legislation that Representative Weeman introduced last year on the government sector union. The public sector pension reform, the public sector unions, the private sector pensions, there are so many areas in which government and private partnerships and the intersection of good government and the private sector continue to erode some boundaries. One of the things I'll get to the pension here in just a little bit, but one of the things that Representative Weeman touched upon. Well, first of all, I really wanted to jump in on that transportation issue, but my car had a pothole on 64 coming in here, so it took me a little while before I could get to the conversation.
Kelly, can you do the?
Nice. I'll give that I'll give that its play.
We'll try again on that.
Yeah, but one of the bills that was introduced by Senator Onder last year, Representative Weeman, John carried HB 238, which was the government sector union reform bill. That's a piece of policy that the Missouri Century Foundation and quite a few other groups have been pushing to get out there. There are four kind of major provisions in that legislation that they've worked for. And one is, give the workers, the folks in that union, a voice in the union elections. The objective, like Wisconsin, like Scott Walker, is to make sure that Missouri employees, those workers under taxpayer dollars, they have a voice in selecting the union they want the representation, who they want to represent them, do they want representation, and then also have that recertification process as well. Is it 2 years, like John was saying? Is it 3 years? Is it 1 year? That's the piece that the legislature is going to have to craft. They're going to have to discuss. But it goes into the collective bargaining, public access to that and that aspect in which taxpayer dollars are being utilized to increase the financial transparency, in that union financial secrecy. So, it's amazing that a private sector union like a Teamsters, et cetera, have more transparency in their financial reporting disclosure than many public sector unions do right now. And the other thing is, those clear labor agreement time standards. So let those, have a very finite, have a very structured plan, have a very structured limit in those agreement limits. So let's.
Why didn't this pass last year?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think the House got out of committee. Representative Weeman is a great steward, and I'm not saying that since simply my back's to him at the moment.
I owe him now.
Yeah.
But, I think it passes the House. And I think one of the things that you have to look at last year's session, not in that particular
Right.
piece of legislation, but look at last year's session. We had a new governor. We had a very young Speaker of the House.
Right.
We had the 16 elections. We flipped every statewide and went from one statewide office holder to the 5.
Right.
So we've got a lot of things. The governor's got an agenda. The new Senate has an agenda. The new House has an agenda. And those things don't always line up regardless of party. Everybody has priorities. Everybody wants to push certain things.
Sure.
Passes the House, gets bogged down for a myriad of reasons in the Senate, and other issues taking precedence. I mean, we got the right to work legislation passed. That took a lot of political capital from a lot of conservatives to push through, to get through the filibuster. That took time. Is there time for other things? The tort reform conversation. There's a lot of things that happen, and being on the lobbying side, the public affairs side, part of me likes when session's out, but we do have a very short session as compared to some other states.
Right.
So with that barely 5 months, not everything's going to pass in the first year of an administration.
Now, it was announced today. I know Representative Weeman and you two are big shots, so you'll probably be there. But the president will be in town in St. Charles Wednesday, I presume, to talk about the tax reform.
Right.
There's a lot of portions of the bill that's not popular. I don't know if you had a chance to listen this morning. I had Kirk Stange. I don't know if you know Kirk. But Kirk was talking about a provision in this bill that men won't be able to write off alimony payments and off their taxes, and the ex-spouse that the alimony is being paid to doesn't have to count that as income.
Right.
So he or she gets free income. You're a political expert. You're a political guy. Where do you see the tax reform bill? Is this going to pass? Is there going to be a lot more give and take to get to where it needs to be passed, or where do you see it? Because right now, I don't see it.
Well, I think there's got to be a lot more give and take in any legislation.
Right.
The Congress needs to pass legislation this year.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a new president. He's doing a lot of things on regulatory reform. With the consumer. I'm going to butcher the acronym.
Right.
Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, with the fiduciary standard for retirement plans being promulgated by the Department of Labor, not the Securities and Exchange Commission, who actually has an understanding of what a stock and a bond does, but the Labor Department. I've got about as much business promulgating financial regulations as the Labor Department. But I think there's got to be a lot more give and take. This is a very complex piece. I mean, it was 1986 is the last time we've had comprehensive tax reform. It took a lot of give and take. It took longer than a year. I mean, it started in the 84 election with Reagan's second term. It was 86. So I think, a lot of give and take. What stays in, was the mortgage tax deduction. Does that stay at $500,000?
Right.
Does that stay at $1 million? I know when they started announcing that, question I had is, okay, if you bought a house and it was $300,000, but it increased in value over 20 years and it's now worth at X, how's that calculated?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of questions that have to be answered. That's incumbent upon the sponsors of the bill. That's incumbent upon the administration to get out there. But I think the president's right, taking the show on the road, putting the impetus on the people, letting them weigh in with their legislators. There's still legislators. There are still some folks that are outliers. There are still some folks that are expressing concerns. So there's work to be done, as with any comprehensive legislation.
One of the things that is not sitting too well with people is the business tax is being reduced from 35 to 20%, and personal income taxes are being reduced as well. But the corporate tax is permanent, and the individual personal income tax is supposed to expire in 2025. Now, the leaders in Congress are saying, future leaders of Congress are not going to raise taxes. Just trust us. Your taxes are not going to go up. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, trust but verify, I think Reagan said.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that the corporate tax is in dire need of a reduction, and it needs to be stabilized so that companies, I like, not to go off tangentially, but we need to onshore that money that is overseas from companies that should have their money here. We need to bring that investment dollar here back to America. But the business tax rate needs to be lower. Those businesses create jobs. Those small businesses create jobs. You know, the statistic that shows those 2, 3, 10 person small mom and pop shops. You know, the small business Saturday type of businesses that are creating the lion's share of new jobs in an economy. Those folks need the stability to grow. They need the extension. We need the personal tax reductions. We need to address the length of those personal tax reductions. But you know, whether you're making X amount of dollars or over X amount of dollars, you know, it's all tied to that first 100,000, 200,000. I'm getting the numbers wrong, but you know, that first income, you're getting that reduction. And what we can do is simplify. It's sorely needed.
Do you think, Jim, we'll ever see the proverbial tax reform on a postcard that you can mail in or do in 15 minutes and send it in? Will we ever see that?
Well, you have that now with the 1040 Easy form. I mean, it's pretty simple to go through that two-sided form, the standard deduction. You fill it out.
When you make about what I make, you can do a 1040 Easy.
Well, and you can do that on a postcard too. But the question is, you know, if something hurts me, it's imperative. If something hurts you, it's a special interest.
Right.
Okay. You know, it's that old Reagan saying, you know, if I lose my job, it's a depression. If you lose your job, it's a recession. Right. You know, we've got to couch how we reform those taxes and how we find common sense balance, and that's tough to do in an environment that's so visceral in Congress right now. I mean, everybody's arguing against everybody. No one's trying to find a common ground. You know, on both sides of the aisle, I think there's a lot of folks that could do better.
Did you hear the Al Franken apology this morning?
It sounded like the one he gave last week.
It sounded about the same. So,
yep.
Where do you see him going? I read a poll last week that said 50% of Minnesotans want him to resign.
Right.
You and I are both in politics,
Mm-hmm.
and when I heard him today, you could tell that he has been huddled with a PR professional and was giving poll-tested answers on what to say. Do you think Al Franken, Stuart Smalley survives?
Man, I don't have a good enough crystal ball on this because, you know, I'll say the same thing about Roy Moore. I'm glad I'm not an Alabama voter. I'm glad I'm not a Minnesota voter. I'm glad I'm here in Missouri. I know the elections are coming up. I know where I stand. But it's really tough. If you look at, was it Conyers? You look at Franken, and you look at Moore. I mean, there is just a lot of accusations and charges and positioning going on, and it's really hard to get down to the facts of, you know, one, you got to believe the victim regardless. I mean, you've got to have an empathetic soul, but you know, in this environment, what does Franken do? Can he survive? Should he survive? How does that affect the Roy Moore race in the same process? I mean, the political calculations, all those things are going on behind the scenes, and that's the part that I'm glad I'm not a part of.
What's really bothered me, and I've said this several times on here in the station, is there seems to be the standard, the bar now, is that if more than one person accuses you and the story sounds similar, even though you can get the story from the internet or the radio or the TV and get the same details, that you're automatically guilty if more than 2 or 3 people come with stories that are similar. I mean, does that bother you? It does me.
Yeah,
big time.
It does, but you know, by the same token, it is that political environment we live in. There are, you know, the thing with Alabama, the thing with Minnesota, these things do tend to come out when one person has the courage to speak out honestly. It encourages other people to speak out honestly. And in a political environment, you know, I think everybody's generally going to be suspect of any comment that is made, regardless of what that issue is. And I think that you have to, you know, you have to have a sense of empathy for those that are coming out. And it's really tough to get in a political campaign environment. It's really tough to separate that type of a emotional charge of moving forward to win an election versus, okay, let's stop and let's address the concerns. It's tough to separate as an individual.
That's Jim Gwinner, partnered with the LS2 Group. We're going to come back with our last segment. I know Jeff hates when I say that, but we're going to come back with our last segment to end up the day. We still have Representative Jeff Wieman in the studio with us. We'll come back and talk some more politics with Jim and the representative.